The guided tours aboard the USS Kidd at the Louisiana Veterans Museum attracted hundreds of visitors every weekend. Families wandered through the narrow passageways. Children climbed onto the deck to admire the massive naval guns, and young Navy sailors assigned to public outreach proudly explained how modern warships operated. Among the crowd walked an 80-year-old man wearing a faded Navy engineering jacket, a white veteran's cap covered with old unit patches, and carrying a small weathered leather notebook tucked beneath one arm. He moved slowly with the help of a polished wooden cane. But instead of looking at the exhibits, he quietly studied the piping, watertight doors, ventilation ducts, and machinery spaces with unusual attention. A group of young sailors noticed him stopping beside nearly every compartment. One sailor smiled. "Grandpa seems more interested in the pipes than the history." Another laughed. "Maybe he's checking whether we built the ship correctly." A third pointed toward the elderly man running his fingers across a watertight hatch. "Careful, sir. She's still floating." The group burst into laughter. The old veteran simply smiled and continued walking until he reached the engine control compartment. There he stopped completely. His expression changed. After quietly studying one section of newly installed equipment for several seconds, he turned toward the nearest petty officer. "Excuse me," he said politely. "Who approved this modification?" The petty officer looked surprised. "Why?" The old man pointed toward a section of piping near the emergency bilge system. "Because if that isolation valve fails under battle damage conditions." He paused before speaking the next words. "This compartment could flood faster than your damage control calculations expect." Several sailors exchanged amused glances. One quietly whispered, "He's serious." Another chuckled. "Next he'll tell us how to sail the ship." Before anyone could answer, the ship's executive officer, Commander Emily Ross, walked into the compartment after hearing the discussion. She looked toward the elderly visitor for only a single second before immediately coming to attention. "Chief Warrant Officer Samuel Sam Whitaker," she said with unmistakable respect. "I never imagined we'd have the privilege of welcoming you aboard again." Every sailor in the compartment froze. Moments earlier, they had believed the quiet old man was simply another curious visitor. None of them realized that Samuel Whitaker had spent 38 years as one of the U.S. Navy's most respected damage control engineers, helping develop emergency flooding procedures that were still taught throughout the fleet. Even fewer knew that inside the worn leather notebook he carried were the original hand-drawn damage control diagrams from a wartime incident that had saved an entire destroyer and more than 300 sailors decades earlier. Before the tour ended, every person aboard the ship would discover why one elderly engineer could recognize a life-threatening mistake with a single glance, learn the heartbreaking story hidden inside his old notebook, and witness how one quiet observation from a forgotten veteran prevented history from repeating itself. The guided tour aboard the USS Kidd had already been underway for nearly an hour. Families wandered through the passageways. Children pointed excitedly at the massive naval guns, and young Navy sailors proudly explained the history of one of America's most famous destroyers. Among the visitors walked an 80-year-old man wearing a faded Navy engineering jacket, a white veteran's cap covered with old service pins, and carrying a weathered leather notebook beneath one arm. A polished walnut cane supported each careful step as he moved slowly through the ship. Unlike everyone else, however, he rarely looked at the exhibits. Instead, he studied every watertight door, every valve, every section of piping, and every bulkhead, as though he had seen them thousands of times before. To the sailors escorting the tour, he looked like nothing more than an elderly veteran reliving old memories. A group of young sailors soon noticed him stopping beside nearly every compartment. One sailor smiled. "That old gentleman has spent more time looking at pipes than the ship." Another laughed. "Maybe he's inspecting us." A third grinned. "Careful, Grandpa. She's still floating." The group laughed together. The elderly visitor simply smiled politely and continued walking. When the tour reached the engineering section, he stopped completely. For several long seconds, he stared at a recently installed section of piping connected to the emergency bilge system. His expression slowly became serious. Finally, he looked toward the nearest petty officer. "Excuse me," he said calmly. "Who approved this modification?" The petty officer looked confused. "Why do you ask, sir?" The old man pointed toward a single isolation valve. "If that valve sticks closed during a flooding emergency, this compartment could fill much faster than your damage control calculations predict." The sailors exchanged amused glances. One whispered quietly, He actually thinks the ship is in danger. Another chuckled. Next, he'll be redesigning the engine room. The petty officer smiled politely. Thank you for your concern, sir. But this system passed inspection. The elderly veteran nodded respectfully. I hope you're right. He closed his notebook and quietly stepped away without another word. Just then, footsteps echoed down the passageway. Commander Emily Ross, the ship's executive officer, entered the compartment after hearing that a visitor had questioned one of the engineering systems. She glanced toward the elderly man. For only a moment she stood perfectly still. Then she immediately walked toward him, stopped at attention, and rendered a crisp naval salute. Chief Warrant Officer Samuel Whitaker, she said with unmistakable respect. Welcome back aboard. The laughter disappeared instantly. Every sailor in the compartment froze. The same elderly visitor they had mistaken for a curious tourist calmly returned the salute. Good afternoon, Commander. Emily smiled warmly. I've hoped I'd meet you someday. Samuel looked around the engine room. It looks different, but it still sounds the same. The commander smiled. It should. She gently accepted the old leather notebook from Samuel with both hands. One of the young sailors looked confused. Mom, you know him? Emily turned toward the group. Know him? She smiled proudly. Every Navy damage control engineer in the fleet knows his name. The compartment became completely silent. Commander Ross looked toward Samuel before continuing. Chief Warrant Officer Samuel Whitaker spent 38 years teaching the Navy how to keep ships afloat after they've already begun sinking. She pointed toward the emergency piping surrounding them. Much of what you're looking at today was built using procedures he helped develop. The sailors stared at the quiet old veteran in disbelief. Only moments earlier they had laughed when he questioned a single valve. Now they suddenly realized they were standing beside one of the men whose work had quietly protected thousands of sailors for generations. Samuel looked once more toward the isolation valve before speaking softly. I truly hope I'm wrong. He paused for just a moment. But 50 years ago, I said those exact same words aboard another destroyer. The smile slowly disappeared from Commander Ross's face. She looked down at the leather notebook in her hands. So, today is about the Henderson, isn't it? Samuel nodded quietly. Yes. He looked once more at the valve before quietly adding, and I think history is trying to warn us one more time. The engine compartment remained completely silent after Samuel Whitaker mentioned the Henderson. The young sailors looked from the elderly veteran to Commander Emily Ross, sensing that everyone except them already understood the name. Emily carefully held the worn leather notebook in both hands. Sir, she said quietly, I never thought I'd hear that story from the man who lived it. Samuel smiled faintly. Neither did I. He slowly walked back toward the section of piping he had questioned only moments earlier and rested one hand against the steel bulkhead. This isn't the same ship, he said. But the mistake is familiar. One of the petty officers finally stepped forward. Chief, what happened on the Henderson? Samuel remained silent for a few seconds before answering. 50 years ago, I was the youngest damage control officer aboard the destroyer USS Henderson. He looked around the compartment. We weren't at war. It was supposed to be a routine engineering exercise. Every sailor listened without speaking. A cooling pipe cracked below the waterline. Samuel pointed toward the isolation valve in front of him. Just like a failure could happen here. Couldn't you just close the valve? One sailor asked. Samuel nodded. That was the plan. His expression became heavier, except the valve had been installed backward during a maintenance overhaul. Complete silence filled the compartment. Samuel continued. The crew thought they were shutting off the flooding. He looked directly at the young sailors. Instead, they were opening it. No one moved. Within less than 2 minutes, the engine room was filling with seawater. Commander Ross quietly lowered her eyes. Samuel continued. We managed to save the ship. He paused, but not everyone made it out. A heavy silence settled over the compartment. Samuel gently opened the old leather notebook. Inside were carefully hand-drawn sketches of flooded compartments, emergency piping layouts, valve positions, and handwritten notes covered with water stains that had faded over the decades. I drew these the night after the accident. One sailor leaned closer. You remembered everything? Samuel smiled sadly. You never forget the day you almost lose 300 people. He turned another page. There, tucked inside the notebook, rested a faded photograph of a group of young sailors standing in front of the Henderson's engine room. Samuel gently touched one face near the center. Chief Petty Officer Michael Donovan. Commander Ross quietly nodded. The man who stayed behind. Samuel looked at the photograph for several long seconds. He ordered everyone else out before trying to close the valve himself. Did he succeed? A young sailor asked softly. Samuel nodded once. He stopped the flooding. His voice almost became a whisper, but he never made it back through the watertight door. No one spoke. The only sound inside the compartment came from the quiet hum of the ship's ventilation system. Samuel carefully closed the notebook before looking once more at the newly modified piping. After the Henderson accident, he said, the Navy rewrote large sections of its damage control procedures. Commander Ross nodded. Many of those procedures are still used today. Samuel smiled gently, because someone paid for them. He pointed once more toward the isolation valve. That's why I couldn't walk past this one without saying something. The sailors who had laughed earlier no longer looked embarrassed. They looked grateful. Commander Ross immediately turned toward the ship's chief engineer. I want a complete inspection of this entire modification before sunset. Yes, ma'am. And compare every valve orientation with the original damage control drawings. The chief engineer nodded without hesitation. Right away, Samuel quietly looked toward the overhead pipes stretching through the compartment. I hope you don't find anything. He smiled gently. But if you do, today will have been worth the trip. The inspection began less than 10 minutes after Commander Emily Ross gave the order. Engineers, damage control specialists, and senior petty officers filled the engine compartment. Comparing the recently modified piping against the ship's technical drawings, Samuel Whitaker stood quietly near the bulkhead with his old leather notebook tucked beneath one arm, saying nothing while the younger sailors carefully examined every connection. Many of the sailors who had laughed earlier now watched him with a very different expression. They no longer saw an elderly visitor. They saw a man whose experience had been written in steel, seawater, and sacrifice. The chief engineer carefully studied the isolation valve Samuel had pointed out before looking back at the blueprint. His confident expression slowly disappeared. Commandant, he said quietly. Emily Ross stepped closer. What is it? The engineer compared the drawing to the piping once again. Chief Whitaker was right. Complete silence filled the compartment. He pointed toward the valve handle. This isolation valve was installed 180 degrees, opposite the original engineering specification. Several sailors stared in disbelief. One whispered, "So, during an emergency." The chief engineer nodded gravely. A damage control team could believe they were shutting off the flooding while actually allowing more seawater into the compartment. No one spoke. Emily Ross looked toward Samuel. How did you notice it so quickly? Samuel smiled gently. Because I stopped trusting labels a long time ago. The room remained quiet. Samuel slowly walked toward the piping and rested one hand on the steel valve. Young engineers often look at diagrams. He gently tapped the pipe with one finger. Old engineers listened to the system. One lieutenant frowned slightly. Listen? Samuel nodded. Every ship talks. He looked around the engine room. The pumps, the vibration, the temperature, the sound of water moving through steel. He smiled. If you spend enough years below deck, eventually the ship tells you when something doesn't feel right. The sailors listened without blinking. Samuel pointed toward another section of piping. Notice these support brackets. The chief engineer looked carefully. They're spaced differently. Samuel nodded. Exactly. Why? Because someone rerouted this section during the upgrade. The engineer slowly followed the new route with his eyes before quietly saying, "That changes the emergency pressure sequence." Samuel smiled again. "Now you're thinking like a damage control engineer." Commander Ross folded her arms thoughtfully. "If this hadn't been discovered?" The chief engineer answered before Samuel could. "During severe flooding, we might have followed the emergency checklist, exactly as written." He paused, and still lost the compartment. The weight of those words settled over everyone present. One of the young sailors who had laughed at Samuel earlier slowly stepped forward. "Chief," he said quietly, "I'm sorry." Samuel looked at him kindly. "For what? We thought you were just an old tourist." Samuel chuckled softly. "That's exactly what I wanted you to think." The sailor looked confused. "Why?" Samuel smiled. "Because if people only respect experience after they know someone's name or rank, they haven't really learned anything." No one answered. Commander Ross looked at Samuel with quiet admiration. "You just prevented us from repeating a tragedy that happened 50 years ago." Samuel gently shook his head. "Not yet." He looked once more at the valve. "We prevented a mistake." He paused before adding, "Now we have to remember why it happened in the first place." Then he slowly opened the old leather notebook again and removed a sealed envelope that had remained hidden between its pages for half a century. Written across the front were just a few words. To the crew that never has to face what we did. The entire compartment fell silent once again. The engine compartment remained completely silent as Samuel Whitaker held the sealed envelope in his hands. Even after 50 years, the paper had been carefully preserved inside the old leather notebook. Commander Emily Ross looked at the faded handwriting across the front. To the crew that never has to face what we did, she looked back at Samuel. "You've carried that all this time?" Samuel nodded. "Chief Petty Officer Michael Donovan gave it to me 2 days before the Henderson accident." "Why didn't you open it?" Samuel smiled sadly. "Because he told me not to." He gently ran one finger across the edge of the envelope. He said, "Open it only when you're standing with a crew that will never have to learn this lesson the way we did." No one in the compartment spoke. Samuel carefully broke the old seal and unfolded the yellowed letter. The handwriting was neat, steady, and unmistakably written by someone who had spent years recording maintenance logs and engineering notes. Samuel took a slow breath before reading aloud. "If you're hearing these words, then someone kept a promise much longer than I expected." A few sailors quietly smiled through the emotion. He continued, "Most people believe ships are saved by steel, engines, or weapons. They aren't. Ships are saved by people who notice one small thing before it becomes a very big problem." Every sailor listened without moving. Samuel read on. "Never let pride convince you that a checklist is more important than your own judgment. Procedures exist because someone paid for them. Wisdom exists because someone survived them." Commander Ross quietly lowered her eyes. Samuel continued reading. "If you ever become the senior engineer aboard a ship, remember this. The youngest sailor who asks a question may save every life on board. Listen before you correct. Teach before you criticize. And if an old sailor ever tells you that something doesn't look right, stop long enough to find out why." Several sailors glanced toward Samuel with quiet embarrassment. He smiled gently and reached the final paragraph. "One day this letter will belong to a crew that never knew our names. That's exactly as it should be. If they never experience what we experienced, then every sacrifice we made was worth it." Samuel slowly lowered the letter. The compartment remained completely silent. Commander Ross finally looked toward the assembled engineers. "Chief Whitaker didn't come here to criticize our work." She paused. "He came here to make sure we never have to write another letter like this." No one spoke. The chief engineer quietly stepped forward, carrying the corrected technical drawing. "Commandant, we've already ordered the valve replaced." Samuel smiled. "Good. We're also inspecting every modification completed during the last overhaul." Samuel nodded approvingly. "Better." Emily Ross then looked at the young sailors standing along the bulkhead. "Gather everyone in engineering." Less than 30 minutes later, more than 100 sailors filled the main machinery compartment. Standing beside the corrected piping, Commander Ross held Michael Donovan's letter high enough for everyone to see. "Today," she said proudly, "an 80-year-old chief warrant officer prevented a mistake that none of us realized we had made." She looked toward Samuel, not because he had newer equipment, not because he had better technology, but because he never stopped paying attention. The entire compartment erupted into respectful applause. Samuel quietly looked toward the repaired valve before whispering almost to himself, "We finally got it right, Michael." The applause slowly faded, but the silence that followed carried far more meaning. Every sailor standing inside the engineering compartment understood that they had nearly overlooked a mistake that experience had recognized in only a few seconds. Commander Emily Ross walked beside Samuel Whitaker toward the center of the compartment, where the newly corrected isolation valve had already been tagged for permanent inspection records. "Chief," she said quietly, "you didn't just find a faulty valve today." Samuel smiled gently. "No?" Emily shook her head. "You reminded us why damage control exists in the first place." Samuel looked around the engine room one last time. Damage control was never about saving ships. He rested one hand against the steel bulkhead. It has always been about bringing sailors home. Complete silence settled over the compartment. Samuel slowly opened his weathered leather notebook one final time. Tucked inside the back cover was a folded sheet of paper filled with handwritten notes. "These were the first damage control principles we wrote after the Henderson accident," he explained. Commander Ross carefully unfolded the page. Across the top were 3 short sentences written in dark blue ink. "Notice the small things. Trust experience without ignoring questions. Every inspection is someone's chance to come home." The sailors read the words in complete silence. Samuel smiled. "Those 3 sentences mattered more than every technical manual I ever wrote." Commander Ross looked toward the engineering crew. "Beginning today," she announced, "every sailor assigned to engineering and damage control aboard this ship will receive these principles before reporting for their first watch." A murmur of quiet approval spread throughout the compartment. Ross then turned toward Samuel once again. "There's one more thing." She nodded toward the passageway leading into the ship's heritage section. Waiting there, beneath a dark blue cloth, stood a polished brass display case that had not been there that morning. Together they walked toward it. Ross gently removed the covering. Inside rested Samuel's weathered leather notebook, Michael Donovan's letter, the corrected engineering drawing, and the original inspection report from the Henderson accident more than 50 years earlier. At the center lay a small brass plaque engraved with the words, "The Whittaker Donovan Damage Control Legacy," dedicated to Chief Warrant Officer Samuel Whittaker and Chief Petty Officer Michael Donovan, whose courage, vigilance, and devotion to every sailor continue protecting ships long after their own watch has ended. The safest ship is the one whose crew never stops paying attention. Samuel stood silently for several moments before smiling. Michael would have said the plaque was too polished. Quiet laughter spread through the compartment. Emily smiled. "Probably." Samuel nodded toward the inscription. "Then let's make sure the crew earns it every day." Years later, after Samuel Whittaker passed away peacefully at the age of 89, every new sailor assigned to engineering duty aboard the ship began orientation. Not in the engine room, but in front of that display, before learning about pumps, valves, flooding boundaries, or firefighting systems. They first learned about one elderly veteran who returned as an ordinary visitor, quietly noticed a single mistake, and prevented history from repeating itself. Beside the display, one final bronze inscription greeted every sailor. "Ships are not protected by steel alone. They are protected by people who care enough to notice what everyone else walks past." Most visitors believed they were looking at old engineering notes preserved for history. Those who knew the full story understood they were looking at something far more valuable, a lifetime of experience, a promise carried across half a century, and the quiet reminder that sometimes the smallest correction made today becomes the reason an entire crew returns home tomorrow. A warship is built from thousands of tons of steel, miles of piping, countless valves, and millions of carefully assembled parts, yet history has shown that even the strongest ship can be lost because of one small mistake that no one thought was important enough to notice. Chief Warrant Officer Samuel Whittaker understood that truth better than anyone. He had learned it not from textbooks or engineering diagrams, but from standing ankle-deep in freezing seawater, listening to alarms echo through dark compartments, and watching ordinary sailors risk everything to save the people beside them. Those experiences taught him that disasters rarely begin with something large. They almost always begin with something small that everyone else ignores. Chief Petty Officer Michael Donovan left behind a lesson that reaches far beyond the Navy. He believed that procedures matter, but people matter even more. Every checklist, every regulation, and every inspection exists because someone, somewhere, once paid a terrible price for the lesson written into it. That is why wisdom should never be confused with routine. Experience is not valuable because it makes someone older. It is valuable because it helps others avoid repeating yesterday's mistakes. The young sailors made the same mistake. Many of us make every day. They saw an elderly man with a cane, an old notebook, and a veteran's cap. They assumed he had come only to remember the past. They laughed when he questioned a single valve because they believed modern technology had already solved every problem. What they did not understand was that technology changes far more quickly than human nature. The greatest dangers are often not hidden inside machines. They are hidden inside the belief that everything must already be correct simply because someone approved it. Samuel often taught that every inspection is really an act of caring. Looking twice is not a sign of distrust. Asking questions is not a sign of weakness. Taking the extra minute to verify a detail may become the difference between a routine day at sea and a tragedy that changes countless lives forever. Those lessons belong not only aboard ships, but in hospitals, schools, factories, businesses, families, and every place where other people depend on our decisions. Perhaps the most unforgettable moment in this story was not when Commander Emily Ross saluted Samuel Whittaker, or when the engineers discovered that he had been right about the faulty valve. It was the moment an old letter written half a century earlier reminded an entirely new generation that the purpose of knowledge is never to impress people, Its purpose is to protect them. That is the highest form of service anyone can offer. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Have you ever known a veteran, engineer, mechanic, teacher, mentor, parent, or friend whose quiet experience prevented a mistake before anyone else noticed it? We'd be honored to hear your story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories about veterans, courage, honor, leadership, sacrifice, friendship, wisdom, second chances, and the extraordinary people whose greatest achievements were not the problems they solved, but the disasters they quietly prevented. May God bless you and your loved ones. Watch over every sailor serving far from home. Protect every crew standing watch through the night. Strengthen every leader who chooses humility over pride. Comfort every family remembering someone who never returned from the sea. And remind all of us that the strongest safeguard in any profession will never be technology alone. It will always be people with the courage to slow down, ask one more question, and care enough to notice what everyone else overlooked. And may you never forget that sometimes the smallest warning spoken by the quietest person in the room becomes the reason hundreds of others live to see another sunrise.